Yeah, so the session will be recorded and available on the GCC's YouTube channel. And we also have a quick survey for you to fill out in the end. I'll drop that link to the survey in the chat right now. Feel free to open up the survey and have it in your browser to fill out later. We in the Professional Development Initiative value your feedback since we use your feedback to design future versions of these pop-up webinars. Again, it's great to see you and welcome. Good afternoon. Thanks for your interest in our session on microcredentials. So as we get started, a little bit of background. So microcredentials are forms of training that complement formal academic training. These are often called stackable credentials. They're programs where participants can develop transferable skills in leadership, career planning, or writing, or demonstrate those skills through a variety of activities. Microcredentials are becoming popular as evidence of workforce readiness. And so this is a little bit of background as we get started. So again, today's session is being recorded. You will be able to access a recording of today's session at the GCC's YouTube channel. And make sure to fill out the survey. There's a link to it in the chat. Bear with me a minute. I just need to let a couple more people into the Zoom room. So I'm excited today we'll be hearing from 3 speakers, my colleague David Blancha at UC Davis, Lauren Easterling from University of Indiana Medical School, and Sasha Goldman from Boston University. Each speaker will give a brief presentation about microcredential programs at their universities and how you can leverage lessons learned for your own certificate program or potential certificate program. After we hear from each of our speakers, there'll be ample time for discussion and Q&A. So for those of you who are just joining us today, also first some background and context about our organization. If you're new to the GCC, the GCC is an international organization of higher ed professionals leading career and professional development for graduate and postdoc trainees. We were founded in 1987 and we're currently a 501c nonprofit. We lead the advancement of graduate level career and professional development by supporting thought leaders, engaged mentors, and innovators. And one of the ways that we do this is through communities of practice. Supplementing our formal mentorship program, communities of practice are informal forms of professional development, mentorship, and networking. You can think of them as working discussion groups for members around shared topics or goals. For example, there are currently communities of practice in the GCC on coaching, mentorship, alumni relations, being an international professional, and microcredentials, today's focus. So I'm especially excited because today's session grew out of a collaboration between the COP on microcredentials and the GCC's new Professional Development Committee initiative, where I'm also one of the members. Our PD committee, chaired by Pallavi Eswara and Amy Solkowski, was founded in August of 2020. Our goal is to help GCC members become aware of the wide variety of professional development opportunities available to them in our organization and beyond. And one major way we've been doing this for the past 4 months is through pop-up webinars that connect our members to GCC initiatives, like our 12+ committees and communities of practice. Our PD initiative also helps members recognize their own competencies as professionals in the graduate career sphere. Likewise, our community on microcredentials is also fairly new. In fall 2020, I put out a call on the GCC's forum to connect with members who are developing or leading microcredentials. I myself had recently inherited a non-credit writing certificate program from a previous coordinator at NC State and was seeking advice on how to streamline operations, boost my program engagement, and engage my trainees. I was happy to find GCC members facing similar issues and willing to share their expertise. Over the past 6 months, we've learned about affiliations between microcredentials and badging, similar but with some subtle differences, how to utilize course management sites to map participants' progress, and how to build stakeholder buy-in, among other things, that helped me to redesign and rebrand the writing certificate program, which we just relaunched this week at NC State. As our working group grew, members took turns organizing the meetings. For example, Sasha Goldman, one of today's speakers, and most recently, Natalie Chernetz, our colleague at Drexel. So we're excited today to share our knowledge of micro-credential or career certificate programs with the wider GCC community. So without further ado, I'm happy to announce today's presenters. David Blancha is the Assistant Director of the Grad Pathways Institute for Professional Development at UC Davis. He supports graduate students and postdocs to systematically acquire career and professional development skills and to prepare them for success in their chosen career path in their graduate and postdoctoral programs. Next, Lauren Easterling is the Director of Trainee Services at the Indiana University School of Medicine Graduate Division, where she manages career and professional development for biomedical science grad students and postdoctoral scholars. She also oversees curricular operations for graduate programs, working with graduate programs and faculty on student academic success and program completion. An instructional designer by trade, Lauren also frequently conducts research on graduate and postdoc professional development. Next, we have Sasha B. Goldman, the program manager for PhD professional development at Boston University, where she develops innovative initiatives to support the next generation of doctoral students in the exploration of diverse career paths and achievement of career goals. Sasha also produces the Vitamin PhD podcast. So our presenters will each give short talks about the micro-credential programs at their universities, with an emphasis on lessons learned and best practices, with the hopes that you too can apply this knowledge to your own current micro-credential program or future micro-credential program. After the presentations, we'll have plenty of time for group discussion and questions. Again, we're glad you can join us. Please bear with me while I admit a few more people to the Zoom room. I'm excited that this is such a popular topic. So first up, we have David. So I'll hand the mic over to David.
Hey, thank you so much, Katie, and thank you for inviting us to be here today, and thank you everyone for joining us. Just to keep things as quick and brief as possible as an introduction, I wanted to start by just kind of explaining where our micro-credentials project is kind of coming from, because I think it's different than a lot of other offices, but it might be familiar for a lot of the situations people who haven't started yet find themselves in. So at UC Davis, in the Grad Pathways Institute for Professional Development, the situation we're really looking at is that we have a broad range of competency areas with training being provided all across campus under a number of different names from different experts with different ideas. And that can be a real challenge for graduate students to navigate and to process and to plan for. And the joke I like to make at orientation and elsewhere is that the university is like very clearly set up, transparently arranged, and well named for undergrads to find their way around. But it can be challenging or impossible for graduate students to know what they have access to, when to take advantage of it, if they're even in the right building at times. And so our goal with designing a system of micro-credentials primarily is to help graduate students and postdocs navigate this system. And so that means our trainees need to identify resources and opportunities that are appropriate to them, both in terms of meeting their goals and in terms of being the right thing for them to access, depending on funding and other constraints. And then they need to be able to identify next steps after a training engagement. One of the biggest dangers of having a lot of disparate providers providing training is that any individual provider doesn't necessarily have the next piece of the puzzle for a trainee. Like the next step that they should engage with might not necessarily come from the same person or the same office. And then in light of all this, in light of all this, let's say, heterogeneity, it can be an additional challenge for students to be able to persuasively describe their experience and skills to prospective employers or anyone else, especially when they start working on similar skills under different names. Conflict management, collaboration, teamwork. There's a lot of semi-synonymous terminology that they're going to see in job ads, that they're going to use themselves, and all of which can get tangled very quickly. And so if we could advance to the next slide, please. And so what we're doing with microcredentials is we're using a product called Badger, and specifically Badger Pro with Badger Pathways, which is a bundle of software from Concentric Sky that allows us to create not just the individual badges that a student would earn for completing a training unit, but also to stack these into pathways to make it as transparent as possible what the next step for a student is after completing any part. And what is one of the key features we learned in looking at different providers that we wanted and that we got from Concentric Sky was the ability to cross-list training opportunities across providers on campus, and also to incorporate other experiences and training opportunities from outside our system into our pathways. So if, for example, we developed a pathway that wanted to acknowledge students' proficiency in Photoshop, for example, we're not going to try and replicate what Adobe already does for training with their own product, but Concentric Sky would let us build that into our system and just point to the certification directly from Adobe or something like that. And so this kind of cross-listing is really important when we're focused on using microcredentials as a navigational tool, because it allows for discoverability at the same time, which is basically the idea that a student who completes part of one pathway will also immediately see visible that they've completed part of a different pathway. They've kind of satisfied the same requirement, and they can see two different branching paths of where they would go next with their professional development and with their training. Can we advance to the next slide, please? And so that's the kind of quick snapshot of our goals and what we're trying to accomplish. And then this is my apologies for the very texty slide about where we are now. And so in 2019, we did our first proof of concept by building out a full, frankly, very complicated pathway specifically for a one cohort training program, Leaders for the Future. This is a leadership training program for graduate students and postdocs that involves a lot of disparate elements. And so we used that to kind of verify for ourselves that Badger, and specifically Badger Pathways, was a product that we wanted to use that had all the functionality that we needed. And so since then, we've been running an open pilot with pathways in communication, leadership training, and writing preparation, and have been using that pilot to get feedback and make small adjustments as far as thinking about project timelines. This is also when we started working on IT vetting for Concentric Sky and the Badger product, and did the first phase of web work to kind of get ready to incorporate this into our website and other online systems. In this spring, oh, I'm sorry, I realize now there's a typo in my slides here. That first spring should be spring 2019 was the beginning of the open pilot. Spring 2020 is right now. And so that at that point, what our major addition right now is that I've recruited a graduate student consultant to work on our initial career-focused pathways development. And so what this is in addition to building pathways around key skills and key skill areas, One of the nice things about the cross-listing feature that we have is that we can use those as the building blocks for career-focused pathways. So we could have a pathway that's just preparation for working in higher education administration, build up of all components that already exist in the system under core skill areas. And so that's where we are today. Through the summer, I'll continue to work with campus partners to develop content spanning kind of that entire wheel of skill areas in my first slide, which we believe are necessary for a public launch in the fall. And based on some of our focus group feedback, what we've heard is students really want, well, not all students, but let's say about half really want more accountability and a tighter timeline. So rather than having things completely available and self-paced, they want to kind of be told, when do I do it and how do I do it quickly? So we're going to be planning some sprint events where someone can complete an entire pathway in 2 quarters or maybe a year, depending on the content. And then ongoing things to be aware of. These are not set it and forget it systems. Constant maintenance, especially in the form of achievability, is what you really need to pay attention to if you have a system like ours, where we are trying to connect all these providers across campus. What we need to do is make sure that our badge criteria continues to be completable in future years. So it has to be a constant conversation with the people providing those trainings to make sure that that's still something that's available. And on top of that, continuing to do gap analysis, continuing to add key skill and career-focused pathways as additional opportunities arise on campus or additional resources are identified. So I think I ran a little long, but thank you so much for your time, everyone. And that's kind of the snapshot of what we're doing at Davis.
Thank you. So I am next, again, Lauren Easterling, and I'm here to talk to you about our micro-credentialing platforms with IU School of Medicine. So our career programming that I'm going to talk about is specific to our biomedical science programs, our graduate students and our postdoc scholars in the School of Medicine, and we call it CareerX. And the CareerX program was something that started development in very late 2018, early 2019. And the way the program was set was with levels where students and postdocs would begin with introductory experiences, what we call Career Explore. As they then advance learning more about career opportunities and diving deeper, we call those Career Expand. And then as they gain hands-on experience, that's Career Experience. As these levels developed, and each level, can we go back to the previous slide? As these levels developed, we started having more and more complexity. This complexity added groups, it added activities, and as we were expanding and shifting to events and experiences, the issue of how do we document, both for ourselves and for our students and postdocs, what our trainees, our students and postdocs have achieved. Also, as part of this, we've had additional tracking needs, such as tracking responsible conduct of research or rigor, reproducibility, and transparency for our NIH requirements. Next slide. Thanks. So we're currently in what I call a soft rollout phase. And much of that is due to the pandemic. I was hoping 2020, 2021 would be a year of a full rollout, high level of advertising, but honestly, we've run into some barriers due to the nature of the distance programming we've been doing. So the plan is to conduct a full rollout, fully advertised with students and postdocs in fall 2021. We already have awarded some digital badges around our summer Jumpstart to Teaching program and with our LinkedIn programming. I started most of our efforts around teaching focused career development. That is my specialty within career development. But we also included LinkedIn and our large complex programs. The idea is start with the larger programs and then be able to work our way down. Like David before me mentioned, we also use Badger. We use an integration with our Canvas learning management system that has worked well using the Canvas modules tool. And while we're not currently using Badger Pathways as part of Badger Pro, we have structured our programs in a way to use Badger Pathways moving forward. And I'll just end this slide by saying I focus most on good learning design, and then on the actual tools and technologies. The next slide. To close out my section, I'll mention that we have this parallel need to be able to document how much our students and postdocs are engaging in experiences, both to school administration and to our partners who are working with us, so they can see whether or not working with us, what type of investment or return on investment they get for spending time helping our students and postdocs. It also provides our trainees a means of documenting their own work to those outside of IU, especially things that do not appear on a transcript or less tangible. And all of this also is related to this need to be able to document complex programs and complex assessments, where we have a sequence of you complete 3 workshops or webinars, then you're in a group, then you do some one-on-one activities, then you meet with a member of our team, and then you're awarded a badge. And the badging platform allowed us to do that efficiently. And that thus ends my section of the presentation. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, and a round of digital applause for Lauren and David. And then next we have Sasha.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and very happy to be here. So I'm, as Katie said, I'm at Boston University, and our microcredentialing platform originates with a task force report that was finished in the spring of last year. And I'm going to give you a bit of a timeline of the project and also show you or tell you a bit about how we ended up with the solution that we've selected. So last year, there was a university task force charged with figuring out what to do about doctoral professional development at BU, because unlike some of our peer institutions, we didn't actually have any dedicated staff people prior to my coming on into my office, any dedicated staff people devoted to PhD professional development. So my first task in my role was to take this report and implement some of the steps. And the goal of the task force report was to figure out how to build upon the existing learning outcomes in doctoral programs by creating a set of core skills that many peer institutions have, but to create programming for professional development that is aligned with those core skills, which we call the PhD core capacities. And those are the 7 skills that you see at the top of the slide. And those are also the badges that we issue for our pathways. And I'll talk about those in a second. So the task force report essentially said, we want to create these core capacities, and we want to create programming in alignment with those capacities in a way that builds on doctoral students' existing learning. And we also wanted to create a framework for students that would allow them to articulate how they're building those skills and what knowledge they're building through their doctoral education to audiences beyond academia. And so what that required was designing a curriculum of professional development, learning that we decided to create similar actually to what Lauren described at 3 different levels. So skill exploration, skill development, and skill application. And then finally, we needed to develop a system of communication for helping students understand not only the core skills that they were building, but also what programming was available to them. Because the way that Boston University is structured, we don't have a central graduate school. All of our schools and colleges operate independently in a sense. And my office is housed within the provost office. And so one kind of piece of feedback that we got a lot from students in working on the task force report and in developing programming for the core capacities was there's so many offices that exist across campus and we don't know who to go to for what. So there might as well be 100, even if there's 5, since the communications system isn't clear and we don't know where to find resources for developing skills in any of these areas. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So starting from the core capacities, I kind of realized that in order to implement a system that integrated these skills into a clear professional development curriculum with a clear mechanism for communication and the ability for students to track and monitor their progress through the curriculum, the best solution for us was to actually create some sort of online learning system that had a dashboard. And we investigated a lot of different potential solutions for this, in addition to looking into systems like Portfolium, into using some existing technologies that integrate into Blackboard, which is what we use as our LMS, some different types of online learning management systems that allow students to create kind of visible portfolios of learning. But in the end, we also landed with Badger because of some of the meetings and the research that we did. And we actually met with David and he told us about his experience. And it became really clear that the kind of structured learning and that micro-credentialing platforms offer, or that Badger offers through the pathways, was really going to help us build out the curriculum that we wanted, help us allow students to track their progress through the core capacities, and to very clearly administer the curriculum through steps that students could either complete individually or in the course of working towards a larger goal. So we wrote an internal grant funded by our digital education incubator to pilot Badger Pro Pathways with the online curriculum. So kind of differently from Lauren and David, we weren't starting out with existing programming that we were going to kind of integrate into this micro-credentialing platform, but instead we built an entirely new curriculum that we put into the pathways. And we created one pathway for each of the core capacities. And we just focused this time in our pilot on level 1. So that's skill exploration. So as they described, badges are issued to students as they complete the learning activities and the assessments. And we internally in our office, and I hired a learning designer postdoc to kind of help build out the curriculum, but also review and build all the assessments. We have that done centrally for this pilot. Can you go to the next slide, please? So our pilot launches on Monday. And what we did for this pilot was we selected, we decided to launch it in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences because it's our largest population of doctoral students at BU. And from that larger group of about eight, there's around 1,000 active doctoral students in that school. We actually created a couple of smaller cohorts. So 48 students from 22 departments that are going to be fellows, and they're getting paid to finish 2 pathways in the course of the summer pilot. So between May 17th and the start of classes in September. We also recruited a cohort of students from 6 departments because Boston University is participating currently in the AAU PhD Education Initiative. And we wanted to collect data on their students and how they participated in the pathways. And then the pilot is also open to all doctoral students in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and they're kind of our control group, right? They're just participating voluntarily, and they can do badges or pathways individually on their own as they're interested. We also, for this pilot, are having bi-weekly learning communities. And the purpose of that actually speaks to something that David talked about, which is in pre-pilot focus groups, it became very clear that students wanted to have conversations about career development and planning and skill building for accountability purposes as well. And so these learning communities will allow students to kind of come together, talk about the work that they're doing in the pathways. And in the future going forward, the plan is to have these kinds of learning communities focused on each of the different core skills so that as students are earning badges in those areas, they'll also be able to kind of talk about best practices and strategies for skill building going forward. So this, like I said, the pathway, the pilot launches on Monday and it'll run through this summer. And then in the fall, we'll be evaluating the pilot program with the intention of adding on pathways in levels 2 and 3. So level 2 being skill development and level 3 being skill application, with the goal of making the pathways available to all doctoral students at BU in 2022. Do I have one more slide? I don't think so. No, so now I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to kind of talk about some big framing questions.
Thank you, Sasha. So in this part of our presentation, we know we all have different experiences that feed into this discussion of micro-credentials and digital badging. So we've broken it out into 3 areas. And the first of these is assessment and alignment. So we have the question of how do you assess student learning with badges? In this, I have my own items, but I also invite my colleagues Sasha and David to contribute to this also.
I can jump in. So I think I mentioned assessment a bit. We are assessing student learning with with reflection questions, essentially via Qualtrics surveys at the end of every badge. And that was a intentional choice because this is the pathways that we're piloting are focused on skill exploration. We really want learners to think about what they've explored and reflect on that and plan for next steps. But we also made that choice because we're not having experts evaluate the assessments in each of these areas. Instead, the real goal is to see that there was some real engagement in the learning for the purposes of our own program evaluation. But I know that's different from what you both are doing.
Yeah, I can jump in and say our kind of catchphrase for what we're doing is on this side of things is that we're vetting exposure, not expertise. And so for most of our assessments are, I would say, as far as like the format of them, they vary wildly. Every one of our badges has kind of its own plan for what that looks like. And this mostly comes down to what our partners across campus are willing to do versus what we need to learn to do or figure out how to scale on our own. So this ranges from submit a quick self-reflection to our global education team wants to meet individually with every student and have a conversation with them in order to vet things. But really, we try to focus as much as possible on how do we assess that a student has been exposed to certain key ideas, not how do we vet that they are an expert or that they're actually able to perform certain skills, because that mostly it just comes from a sense of practicality. Like it's much easier to vet that someone has been exposed to the idea of the fundamental attribution error or something like that by just asking them to report back what that is, than it is to vet that they're able to apply that with compassion in situations of conflict, for example.
And on the issue of exposure versus different levels of engagement, in our case, I'll answer several of the questions on screen all in one, is, again, like I said at the end of my section, the focus was on good learning design. And this focus was, as I talk with our faculty, students, and postdocs, like emphasize backward design, emphasize starting with what are your learning outcomes, moving to then what are your assessment strategies, and then the actual activity design. And when it comes to our digital badges, our assessments vary greatly depending on the activity. We have webinars in there. So in that case, much of that is exposure or is attendance. We have learning communities where people present journal articles, where people are engaging in projects, they're providing peer feedback. And in all cases, the emphasis really is about aligning our learning assessment strategies to match the type of learning, the desired outcome we have with each activity. So my answer is it's going to vary greatly across. And one thing I will say, and I'll ask my colleagues to jump on this last question, who does the verification of student learning? I would say I do, and so does one of my colleagues in the office. I don't know if she's attending today, but we do it, and I assign the badges, and it's a lot of work. We've been able to streamline some of that through technology, which will be our next slide in a moment, but a good assessment takes a lot, can take a fair amount of work, but it's absolutely worth it. Anything else from David or Sasha on assessment before I hand it over to David?
Just to answer the kind of next question about aligning our outcomes, for us, the goal was very much to create structured learning that aligns clearly with our core capacities curriculum, and engagement there and engagement in the pathways is very clearly demonstrated through both work products, but also through engagement in our programming, because one of our real goals in using the microcredentialing platform as a tracking mechanism was to give students the credit for spending time coming to our workshops and going to our programs, in engaging with faculty panels and those sorts of things. So very much outcomes and alignment are wrapped up in the assessment piece, similar to what Lauren said, and our strategy for designing those assessments is kind of one of the first things we think about in developing all of those programs as well.
One thing I'd like to add, just as a nice feature that we haven't really addressed of digital badging, is that we haven't gotten too much into like the background technology, but digital badges do exist on a blockchain, and they have metadata attached to them. So one thing I think that's really cool that you can do, and we are planning to do some of, but haven't done much of yet, is you can attach metadata to the badge itself. So when you do have work products, there's no reason not to embed those in the badges themselves. So if you have a 3MT style competition, for example, that was recorded and that your winners or finalists earned a badge for, you could embed the video of their winning presentation into the badge itself. If you were vetting, portfolio of artistic or other, or architecture products, you could embed that in the badge as well. So that's another thing to think about in terms of sometimes what you can do with designing digital badges is say, all I'm vetting is that they completed a project, and if you want to assess the quality, it's attached. Take a look, and that can be another strategy.
And one last thing before I hand it to David, and I'm just making sure we have enough time for everything, is on this idea of embedding and attaching. That is part of our strategy long-term. For any badges associated with attendance or participating, there isn't much to attach. But if students or postdocs are creating a product, creating some sort of resource, as some of our activities, as you progress from level 2 to level 3, these activities do have those components. We are definitely leveraging that, and that is something that was definitely important to us in going with the digital badging approach. One last comment, also building now off of Sasha, is this idea of going back to the assessment piece. And something I didn't mention before was all of our assessment strategies are listed as part of our badge metadata. So the metadata in a badge, and again, next slide we'll get into technology, but it's the metadata that really makes this appealing for us. For example, we will have, yes, the name of the badge, but in our case, we list all of our learning outcome statements. We list all of our assessment strategies so that if a student, a postdoc share this, or if another stakeholder looks at the badge definitions, they will be able to see exactly what was expected of the badge holder. This is the fundamental flip side to being able to attach items. Well, this is the core of the definition of the badge. And that is important to us because in the past, I've created certificates of completion for our students and postdocs. But when you receive a certificate of completion and then you go to another institution, say, see, I got a certificate of completion in a teaching program. Well, what does that mean? And in the case of a digital badge, it includes in there exactly what this means. Here's what was expected of everyone, and here's what had to be done to complete it. And then even further, here's examples of the work they did to complete it. On that note, unless there's any other comments from my two colleagues, I will hand it over to David to discuss the technology section.
Speaking of technology, I'm going to unmute myself. All right, so kind of the focal questions that we have related to technology. Again, I'd be happy to get into it at another time, but it's not really important for our purposes as far as like how the blockchain of microcredentials actually works. But for our purposes, I think the biggest questions are really first, what are the benefits of using digital badges? As I'm sure many of you saw in chat, digital badging is just one form of micro-credentials. Second, we've actually been discussing this a bit in chat already. Why did you choose the platform you've chosen? And then also talking a little bit timeline for development. And I think as you've heard from all three of us, it's actually really, the timeline varies quite a bit, just depending on what sort of infrastructure you already have available to you. And so I would just jump in really quickly just to kind of capture some of what has been going on in chat in case you missed it. For broad strokes, as you've heard, we're all using Badger in one form or another. There are a lot of other providers out there like Credly, like Portfolium. I can tell you one of the nice things about Badger is just cost-wise. I don't have like a very like, fully fleshed out comparison matrix or things like that, but you can get started with Badger very inexpensively. You can in fact get started with Badger for free, which was one of the things that allowed us to learn a lot more about it as a platform than something like Portfolium, for example, where we could like kind of do a demo, kind of look around, but we couldn't like try it out and see what the system looked like. A second thing is anyone who's using Canvas. Canvas was, I'm not sure about the direction, but Canvas and Badger integration is like about as tight a connection as you'll find in the IT world. Before Concentric Sky acquired Badger, I believe there was some shared ownership between them and the body that owns Canvas. And so when you have access to that already, that might be a reason to try Badger first. And then finally, I know that there's more development happening in this area, but at least when I was starting, Badger was the only provider with a pathways style system that allowed us to stack and, more importantly, display the stack of credentials really transparently to students. And so I think I'll leave it there for myself and invite Sasha or Lauren to jump in.
I will go ahead and jump in. I put some of this in the chat, but for us, not only is there the free dimension of Badger, but we get to take advantage of a system-wide license around Badger, and therefore there's no additional cost to us. So that is one of the perks we get from being part of a large institution and a large system. But if we didn't have that license, Badger would still be the best option because of the cost issue, and also because we're using Canvas. Canvas is our system LMS, and that integration really is the game changer for me. The fact that I can attach badges to Canvas modules, and in some cases for our lower stakes and lower not in a degrading way, but as far thinking lower, if you're going through something like Bloom's taxonomy, like lower order learning outcomes, that some of those can sometimes be automated. I still usually add in Canvas an item that requires me to manually approve or disapprove a badge so I can keep my finger on the pulse, but that having those tools together is just really good. I can't say enough good about it.
Yeah, for us, I mean, actually the digital badging piece was probably the biggest challenge in convincing stakeholders, and by stakeholders, I mean some faculty and administrative leadership, like that this was an important kind of tool for learning. But really what ended up sealing the deal for us in speaking with example or convincing our associate provost for grad affairs was the research that's done on the value of digital badging as a tool for competency-based learning, and how many studies have been done on how the gamification of learning, because badges like this really come out of video game leveling, how it actually incentivizes student learners. And so that was kind of the flip side of the ability to capture and track learning through structured self-paced modules, which is why we didn't go with something like edX, because those are these kinds of structured courses that, you know, you go from start to finish. And we really wanted an option that would provide a choose your own adventure if you want, or choose this adventure that we've laid out for you. So that was helpful in really helping us to seal the deal in deciding on Badger, but also kind of some of the background on the benefits of using the digital badges as tools beyond what has already been brought up by Lauren when she was speaking earlier, the ability to see what the earning criteria is for each badge, the ability to link the work products to the badges themselves, so that those pieces can go along with students going forward to create kind of a living, movable portfolio.
Excellent. So I think one other something else I'd like to add in is just on kind of like the macro level. One of the big benefits of digital badges as a technology, as an object, that I like the sound of, but of course we're all in like too short of a time scale to have realized the benefits of this, which is it exists independent of us, which is to say that a student can earn a digital badge and do what they want with it and have that record forever, even if, if the Grad Pathways Institute becomes the Grad Studies Career Center, or if UC Davis, becomes, UC Chico. If any of those things change, the badge persists and the record is there kind of forever. And because it's designed to, the kind of open badge system is designed to work that way, it's very seamless to integrate it into all the places where you would want it to be visible. You can put it in your LinkedIn profile, you can put it on a personal website, you can tweet it, you can put a QR code on your resume, if that's not too wild for the industry you're trying to get into. And so that's why I think digital badges as the type of micro-credential that we're pursuing is nice. But the other side of that is it's also the most developed technology around micro-credentials. And so we have providers like Badger with really, I would say, pretty user-friendly interfaces for us to build the badges. And you have things like teams that can support that. Whereas other forms of technology are much younger, are much less supported, and you'll have a harder time finding help or assistance outside of programming them yourselves, which I certainly don't aspire to learn to do. All right. As far as timeline, Lauren and Sasha, what would you say are the most significant barriers that you've run into so far?
So jumping in here, and this is not a criticism of the unit I'll mention, but it was a reality. So in our case, I cannot actually go in and create the badge. Badges for our institution are centralized in our university IT office, in our learning division's technology. So if I want an actual badge created in Badger, I then have to contact someone from our Center for Teaching and Learning, who then works with our e-learning team to then develop the digital badge, which means I have to have all the metadata prepared. I have to have all the items prepared in advance and have those laid out. And that's something I didn't even though I used to work around the technology side of badges in a previous life, I didn't appreciate how much pre-work that was when I was trying to launch badging. And that alone, having everything lined up in advance, did delay our timeline a bit. So not having direct access within the Badger platform was a bit of a delay. At the same time, having direct access to the Canvas integration, once our IT unit enabled the Canvas integration, then things went well.
I kind of want to knock on wood because my pilot starts on Monday. But I will say that we have been quite lucky in not hitting any real barriers so far in terms of the technological or curriculum development. However, I think our biggest challenge is actually something that I put in the chat in response to Erin's question. It's really less about the technology itself or the development piece of it, but instead about translating the merit and value of actually doing the badge in addition to, if you're already doing the workshop, if you're already doing the training, why am I going through this platform? And showing the value of that, as well as convincing leadership and faculty and other stakeholders of the value of encouraging their students to do this kind of intentional, thoughtful, planned out professional development learning on their own.
Yeah, and I would love to jump in on the thread in chat with the question from from Erin and the answer that Sasha already gave about whether or not kind of employers find the credentials compelling. There's kind of I guess 3 answers I like to give to this in different aspects. The first one is just the straightforward answer, which Sasha mentioned, which is there's some literature on it, and it shows that it's very industry specific. There are industries that love digital badges, and there are industries that don't consider them valuable at all. The second thing I would say, also in line with Sasha's answer as before, is like, that's not really our object. Like, if our goal was to design something specifically just to be valuable on the job search in a way that was being recognized by employers, all I would say is that's less of a student service project, and we'd be going about it all wrong. We should probably be starting with, hey, employers, what do you value and how can we build that? And I don't think any of us are necessarily interested in that, certainly not in any of our job descriptions. And then the third aspect I like to point to is, I think with young technology, this is a question that we get a lot from people who might be thinking about technological adoption a little bit backwards, just a tiny bit, which is, if a broader system is going to value these digital credentials, it's going to be because they already exist, and it builds up from repeated hires who have those credentials and seeing the value in that, as opposed to convincing an employer that conceptually this credential is a good thing and you should value it before seeing how it plays out with a trainee in your workplace. So with the young technology, and we see this in computer science actually quite a bit, where you had these digital credentials that were not valued at all and are now considered the gold standard in areas like machine learning, where, for the first 5 years of existence, no one valued them because they didn't know what they were. But now that they see everyone who has that credential has a really good grasp on that area, now the employers can use it as shorthand for vetting that. So I think that's how we should think about the credentials we're developing as well, which is, if it's young, there should be no expectation that an employer values it until there's been a sufficient period for them to have experienced, or at least for their colleagues to have experienced, the benefits of hiring someone with the credential.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, one thing I want to add is, not a feature that we haven't actually taken advantage of yet in Badger, but that they offer is integration with standardization or standards of learning that already exist. So the MZ skills technology is something that you can actually align with each of your badges if there is an existing standard out there. For example, if you're creating badges for a nursing program, right, and they have these kinds of credentials or competencies that they have to meet. But the other thing I wanted to say is, this is a young technology, right? Like digital badges have existed since around 2010, but they haven't been used in the graduate education space in this sort of way on a widespread scale quite yet. So, the real answer is no. Employers don't really across the board value these type of micro-credentials, but at the same time, we're even combating the similar or parallel challenge of working with our doctoral students to help them translate their skills, regardless of micro-credentials, to careers outside of academia, right? Because of the state of the job market at this point. So this actually, something that I say to my doctoral students is, this is just another tool in your tool chest for helping you translate and articulate the kinds of experiences that you had, the kind of learning that you've done, and the kind of professional development that would make you an asset to any office, any career.
And if I can chime in and piggyback off of both of you on one thing, I want to go back a bit in the thread to this idea of the employers and industry partners on the value of badges. We have what I'll call a very large pharmaceutical company based here in Indianapolis. And when I was working with them on a project, I mentioned digital badging, and there was initially some pushback. And pushback isn't, once I talked with them, like, can you tell me more about how you responded? They talked about how they've seen some good badges and some less than good badges. They've seen how some places will really put meaning into a digital badge, and others will treat it like you can't see, I have a Fitbit on. Have it like, oh, you got your water in for the day, or you got your steps in for the day. And there was some initial question about the meaning. And I think part of it is, again, like Sasha was saying in the chat, like helping our students and postdocs be able to better articulate the value and articulate what they learned and how they learned it, and be able to talk about their evidence of learning. That very much the badging helps create a scaffold for that.
Awesome. So if there's nothing else on the tech, I think in the interest of time, we should probably slide over to curriculum and content development.
Yeah, so this is, I think, an interesting piece for all of us, because we all definitely have been approaching this differently. And I'd love to hear from Lauren and David about your approaches to getting started on that piece.
Yeah, so I can say, so the starting point, well, let's rewind a second. So my real starting point, I came in at an interesting and I would say ideal way into this project, which was I was brand new to my position. I didn't know the landscape of UC Davis very much at all, beyond what I had like kind of done in preparing, to interview for my position and to talk about it in that sense. And so given the way our program is structured around really just trying to map the campus, I needed to map the campus for myself anyway and kind of see what was available and notice things that, the Career Center is the internship and Career Center. So it's under I, it's not under C. The Writing Center there's a university writing program, but there's nothing called a writing center. and things like that. And so my start was with identifying people around campus who knew what I needed to know to navigate the campus myself and could therefore speak to like, where are students getting lost and where do we want to point them? And every person I met across campus, all of our partners always kind of replied with the same, they find this, but they never find that kind of thing. So they all, they are aware of our career fairs, but many postdocs don't know they can come for one-on-one advising or something like that. And so from there, that's where I kind of started to like brainstorm the broader network idea and the idea that I would need something like Badger Pathways to accomplish our goals, as opposed to something like Credly, which would just be a list of badges. And so then from there, for building the curriculum, I have like a very routine process at this point, which is I meet with the content expert. We talk about what would be kind of the smallest valuable credential that we could give to a graduate student or postdoc. What are you already doing that contributes to that? And then what's missing? And so again, like from our perspective, we're not really looking in every case at like, let's build up a full curriculum or full thing from scratch, but rather, what are graduate students already doing? How can we give them credit for that? And what, if anything, do we need to add to that to make that really valuable for them? And so this has led to some really cool collaborations around campus, and it really helps us build stakeholder buy-in, where we get people agreeing to take on more of the vetting work and thinking about adding more to their existing programming, not just for the sake of making the badge work, but because the conversation was around, well, what's the skill we really want to recognize, and is there a gap there? As opposed to us coming in saying, well, we need this badge, and so we need you to start doing X, Y, and Z to make the badge possible, really making it a conversation about, is there something missing from that would make it make sense for us to have a badge in the first place, and letting that being generated from our content experts.
I will add to this, like, I understand much of what, and have experienced similar to what David has and what David has just talked about. Curriculum design is in my blood. So for me, I know instinctively what to do, and much like David mentioned, like talk to stakeholders, look at the smallest unit, really work on structuring this. In my case, and one of the reasons why I asked Katie if I could have a little longer introduction at the beginning is I included in there my career side, but also I am our curriculum specialist for all of our graduate programs. So in addition to our career side, I manage our curriculum side too, which in this case has been extremely advantageous because I have my proverbial fingers on both pulses simultaneously. So that, and where this becomes important is we don't want to duplicate, and we want to be able to complement programming. So in addition to doing what an instructional designer and developer normally does, I want to ensure that if we're creating, say, a badge around responsible conduct research, that it aligns with what we're doing in the classroom around RCR, aligns with the 3 different RCR courses we have, and that those efforts are working in concert. So being able to speak across the training enterprise, whether it's co-curricular with career programming or curricular or anything in postdoc training. And I really start with gathering information. I talk to people. I talk to people more than they probably want me to talk to them, and bring this together into a coherent plan, and then work with them on shaping the plan around the badge. And the idea is to not just build a badge out of fancy, which I will say early on, I did that, but to be able to build a digital badge that fits within overall postdoc training and grad student education timelines and arcs. So.
Yeah, and just to add on to what both of you said, I mean, I think our approach is a bit different because we were not really trying to map badges onto existing programming, since we didn't have a lot of existing programs, since there wasn't a me before me. So where I started was really actually with a grassroots approach and talking to doctoral students about what support and what programs and what professional development they felt that they needed and they weren't getting. And then really surveying the landscape and talking to different stakeholders, just like you both said, about what they could contribute, what they thought was missing, and really having conversations also with alumni about what skills they felt were most important in the careers that they went into. And that's kind of where we got started. So I think you both actually spoke a bit to this mapping badges onto training opportunities as well as stakeholders. But I wonder if you could both talk a little bit more about the specificity of working with external offices in content creation, because that's, I know, a topic that's come up a lot in our microcredential working group. And again, it just came up in the chat, like how this gets integrated, how stakeholder work and programs get integrated into the badges.
Yeah, I could say for my part at present, I would say directly and manually is the best way to describe it, which is, yeah, I stay in touch with all of our stakeholders. This is what I was referring to earlier in the meeting today when I talked about maintenance and making sure that things continue to be achievable. One of the things that I would consider not a barrier, but definitely an element of friction, is that we have a lot of stakeholders presenting trainings in the same area under different names year to year. And that makes it hard to refer to them in the badging system because they don't have one name. But there's no reason we can't just, use English to our advantage and say, well, you have to complete this or that, and just list all of the available titles for things. It has led to some conversation with stakeholders of, are you able to commit a little earlier to a name and to a timing for a workshop? But I think those are actually just that's all to our benefit and to our students' benefit anyway, to have more pressure to kind of that earlier commitment and marketing anyway. And so one thing I would say about as far as getting their events loaded in with regularity is we are not committed as the Grad Pathways Institute to having every training opportunity always offered at a regular interval. It's nice that we'll go back and look and say well, we haven't done this in a year and a half, so maybe it's time to create some pressure to bring it back around again. But that just hasn't been part of our workflow so far. And I think that's another reason why we need the microcredentials in the first place, is because we don't have that predictability for our students where they can know that this training is always offered on January 10th or anything like that. I'd love to meet the person who works at a university that does function that way, because it seems like a dream. But I think that's it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. It's well, we need the microcredential system to direct students to these things because of the irregularity of them being available.
And thank you for your comments on that. I would add to that one of the things I try to do most often with external stakeholders is to consider I'm happy I inform them about the digital badging component. I'm willing to talk about it, but I try not to let it feel like an extra layer for them. As I'm partnering with them, I believe I do, and we in our team focus on, let's talk about developing the program. And I will prompt them like, okay, this is great. I need a program name. I need an event name by this time. I need presenters by this time. And I don't explicitly say it's because like, okay, I need to set up our event management system, which is then how I export documents to then do a by hand comparison in Excel or another system of have these students completed all these activities and requirements to then manually award a badge. I don't share that with the external stakeholders. I share the key elements that they need to contribute and do it in a way that's more about the program and more about what they're contributing, really respecting their time and their effort, and structure what I'm saying to get what I need. But the badging system is really my issue, not theirs.
That's my approach as well. You know, when I'm working on building a program with another office, I mention when there are opportunities to turn something into a badge, or when something would be particularly well suited for creating space in the pathway. But similarly, like, as I'm sure you all know, nobody wants extra work put on their plate. So we basically tell everyone, like, you envision it and we'll build it, but that has to work within our timeline and our capacity as well, anytime something like that comes up. So I think that's all the questions we got to, unless there was anything else either of you wanted to add. But otherwise, I think we can do questions.
I'm just going to throw in just one like, positive anecdote here. Sometimes when we introduce this to people around campus, they've really taken it and run with it on their own. So best example at Davis is global education. Heard about what we were doing. We had a couple sit-down meetings, and they've dedicated an entire working group and committee to designing a full stream of global education badges. And they're going to start with graduate students and then move on to undergraduate students. And I've been only in contact with them largely in an advisory role, with the promise that, like, once it's fleshed out and ready to go, I'll just go ahead and import it. But I think there are ways of talking about this and sharing this with stakeholders where they want to do the work themselves, where they see the advantage to it, and they want to maintain the kind of curricular control over it. Which I consider, like, that's fantastic. And in fact, that's what I hope the future of this program looks more like, which is getting different trainers across campus, maybe even schools or departments, excited about it, seeing how easy it is to integrate the platform and how good it is for students to be able to discover things across different training opportunities in that way, but wanting to maintain curricular control over the design of things. So I'll just throw that in as, like, sometimes it's not more work. Sometimes it's just inspiring others to do it themselves.
And only thing I would add going off of that is, it's the same mantra I have when it comes to any work I do: relationships, relationships, relationships. That the parts of our program that grow, they grow when I have good relationships with internal stakeholders, other external to our unit, but internal to our university offices, working with external partners, like being willing to explain this, having an elevator pitch version of this, in addition to the longer version of what we're doing. And like David mentioned, the more I've talked about it with people, the more ideas have sprung up. I mentioned this, since we have so many students and postdocs funded on NIH grants in our institution, rigor and reproducibility and transparency and responsible conduct of research. The idea for badges in those areas have grown out of people in other units and centers on campus hearing me talk about this. And they thought like, oh, this would help address X problem we have. And that's developed new relationships, which in turn will hopefully develop new opportunities. And just as much as I have to devote time to the technology and the design, it's really the relationship building with partners and with others that's been very important to our programs to date.
Yeah, so thanks y'all for your interest, and the big round of digital applause to Lauren, David, and Sasha for sharing their wisdom on micro-credential best practices. I hope you all had an opportunity to learn about competencies in the areas of program management, technology, curriculum design, and project management, most importantly to building relationships with our various campus stakeholders. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers and to y'all for your interest in our pop-up webinar on micro-credentials. We're almost at time, and it's great too that we had a lively discussion going in the chat within our panel discussion. I noticed that there was one question that perhaps our panelists could briefly clarify. So Sean asked about the formats of the trainings, like about how much of these trainings are asynchronous online and how much of it are facilitated. I guess Sean means how much of it's facilitated in-house. Y'all mentioned collaborating with a wide variety of campus units, and even grad students and postdoc trainees leading the workshops.
Yeah, I can say at Davis, the digital badging platform has zero impact on the medium with which our trainings are delivered. We make that decision completely separately and then adopt the vetting process to how the training already exists. Realize this is pretty important, both in terms of, well, we had to make a lot of changes this year for how things are delivered. So we weren't really going to have our choice there anyway. And realizing that we wanted to address things like the Ombuds office does a conflict management training that involves sitting down people face to face, and we don't aspire to replace the value of those trainings or to, again, influence instructors into delivering things in a medium that doesn't make sense to them for the sake of digital stuff. But I think the last year has taught us that, you know, more of our training should just be available asynchronously anyway. This was kind of always an issue of access and inclusion that maybe it took this last year to really kind of motivate some of the efforts to make those changes, but those probably should have been there all along in certain cases.
If I can jump in, I would just add to that. In our case, I intentionally developed the badging around our synchronous or mostly synchronous programming first, because that was the largest logistical hurdle and planning hurdle. And if we could do that, we could do almost anything. And that seems odd, especially during this pandemic time, but especially with the pandemic, being able to track well the things we were doing via Zoom or interactive groups has been important. I know there was a question in the chat related to LinkedIn Learning and other tools, and I have to say we focus less on that because it's been a bigger lift ensuring that we have all of our other programming in place, but we are definitely going to come back to that.
Yeah, just to tack on, most of our programming started when I started, which was on Zoom. So that means that most of our learning is online now, and we've recorded all of the workshops so that they're uploaded for asynchronous viewing. However, so many of our workshops are interactive. So as those happen, they get updated, and we've been very intentional about, well, one of the nice features of Badger is that you can edition badges and update them with new content. And so that's something that we looked for and will be doing as well as we kind of figure out what version of hybrid our programming will take going forward.
Yeah, thanks again, Sasha, David, and Lauren for your insightful answers. And thanks y'all too for your interest in the burgeoning topic of micro-credentials. Judging by the lively discussion in the chat and the questions, I'm sure like will be a topic to explore for years and semesters to come. Yeah, thanks again, you all, for your interest. A few closing announcements. Don't forget to complete the exit surveys. There is a link to it in the chat. We in the GCC Professional Development Committee really value your feedback and use it to help plan the topics and logistics of future pop-up webinars. A quick closing announcement too, and a shout out for all of our communities of practice. These communities of practice complement the GCC's extensive formal mentoring network with informal mentorship and professional development opportunities. This is just a sampling of some of our communities of practice. If you'd like to get involved in them, feel free to reach out to any of the organizers. You can also watch for occasional email updates through the GCC's listserv forum. That's often where organizers will put out a call for participants in a community of practice. Lastly, don't forget about these other upcoming professional development opportunities with the Graduate Career Consortium. We have one coming up on May 25th at 12 noon on reimagining humanities graduate education toward institutional change with Katina Rogers. And lastly, too, we have our big annual conference and pre-conference Meeting the Moment coming up on June 22nd through 23rd. GCC members, watch for announcements and check our GCC website calendar for more information on these professional development events. You can also visit our website, gradcareerconsortium.org, to learn more about these events and the benefits of GCC membership. Thanks again for this lively micro-credentials pop-up webinar. It was great to meet you all virtually too. Stay safe, take care, and hope our paths cross at a future online event.
This was very good, Katie. Very well done.
Yeah. Thanks to Pallavi and Amy for your help in facilitating it. The turnout was awesome. I really liked to how partners just started asking questions and discussing topics in the chat. And David, Lauren, and Sasha too did a great job organizing this as a panel discussion.
Yeah, well done. Yeah. Talk to you all. Bye.
Bye. Take care. Take care, Amy. Bye.